Suddenly the room fills with like an IV and midwives and doctors, and they like look at me and I look at them and they're like, "Oh, don't stress." And I'm like, my name is Liz, and on this channel I talk about all things that pique my interest as a mother of two, content creator, and a scientist. It's a very casual setup today. It's just me and my girlie at home. We're not up to much. She's actually right there on a mat. And seeing how casual this ordeal is, today I wanted to talk about a personal topic while weaving in some common myths and misconceptions. Welcome to my birth story. This is the birth story of my second baby. I think out of my experiences, this one is probably the most valuable for new moms. TLDR, yes, I did have a plan. No, not everything went in accordance with it. Yes, I did have a good birth experience all in all. Just to set the scene, I live in Australia. Both of my births were through the public system, and just so you can benchmark it against your country, there were no out-of-pocket expenses for the birth care or most of the appointments before and after it. However, the ultrasounds do amount to a few hundred because unfortunately Medicare, the local healthcare system, doesn't quite keep up with the rising costs of providing those services. We also chose to do the genetic testing, which set us back a further $400. My preferred pre-birth care is called midwifery group practice, when you're basically seeing one midwife for the most of it. This is how I did it with my firstborn. However, this program takes in very limited women, and it's very, very competitive because of it. Thus, this time I didn't get in, but I did get connected with a local midwifery practice, and at the end got seen by the same midwife throughout. This sets the scene a little bit, so it's time to dive into my birthing experience. In the movies, you often see those dramatic scenes of waters breaking in the middle of the store aisle, in the car, in a dark alley, etc. In reality, it's extremely, extremely rare for it to be such a dramatic, explosive event and the first precursor of labor. So how it started this time was actually really uneventful. I was just eating dinner, and then I started feeling some mild period-like pains. And because this is not my first time, and it was a week before my official due date, I was kind of really suspicious of that. It could also be some what they call practice contractions, so we weren't 100% sure at this point. I went for a relaxing bath because I kept having those cramps on and off. Around 9 p.m., this is where we've put our toddler to bed. And at this point in time, I was really uncomfortable pregnant, so my husband would sleep in a separate room with my toddler, and I would sleep alone in the main bedroom. So I was laying there trying to fall asleep, but unfortunately it just wasn't happening. And around 11:30, I just woke up from this really short, maybe 15-minute nap, got up and thought, oh, this must be it. What they often show in the movies is how when the labor starts, it kicks in really, really intensely and someone must rush to the hospital or else they risk popping the baby out right in the car. Birth can be quick and intense, but even that usually doesn't translate into quite this quick and intense. Moreover, you're discouraged from going into the hospital until your contractions get really close together and become very consistent. This is especially through the public system when they don't have that much capacity to just leave everyone hanging in there. Given that labor in factuality can be quite a long process, going over hours or even days. And I just went downstairs and started pacing. At this stage, I was pretty confident that my labor is gradually and steadily kicking in. I started timing contractions and they were getting consistently a few minutes apart. And around 1 a.m., it got to the point where they were still bearable, but I could tell, and this is something that you will probably just feel, there is kind of a point of no return. Your body knows this is happening. And this wasn't just because this was my second baby. I had this realization with my first as well. It was just like, gotta go, it's on the way, like a Pokemon egg hatching. So I woke my husband up and we went to the hospital, leaving our toddler in the care of my mom, who was staying with us at the time to help with birth and postpartum. Car ride to the hospital with contractions is one of my least favorite things in the universe. Honest to God, it's awful. Every bump, you feel it, and contractions are getting stronger and stronger. However, it's still not to the point where you're this like inconsolable blabbering mess. Can joke, can talk, everything is fine. You're just having strong cramps that are gradually picking up. So we get to the hospital. Because I'm a second-time parent, they didn't actually even question me on admission, which they might typically do. So you go, they kind of measure your blood pressure and do a series of questions, which amount to, are you sure? Are you confident? Well, it's not what they ask, but you know that this is where it's going. Again, they're trying to prevent admitting you too early, to avoid you waiting around, and to avoid spreading their already thin resources way too thin. It's a little bit annoying, to be honest, but I do understand, having worked in the health system myself. So I get admitted and I go to this initial checkup area where they offer to check how far along are you. And I will say that you can decline those checks, but it will then really slow down the process of admission. So they hooked me up to the CTG and they also did cervical dilation test. But this is where it's important to start really advocating for yourself. They told me that I'm only 4 centimeters dilated. It means that you're probably not about to give birth, and it's not likely to happen like in the next few hours, allegedly. However, research shows that cervical dilation is not the best indicator, and it's much more complicated than that. In fact, apart from this one cervical check, I refused all others for this birth. I highly encourage you to talk to your health provider, look into reputable sources, read some evidence, and you can make this decision for yourself. So, okay, I'm only 4 centimeters dilated, and they kind of go like, oh, maybe you should go home for another few hours. I sort of told them like, okay, I can go home, but I just know like I can just feel I'll be back in 20 minutes. And the senior midwife who was on that shift overheard me, and she made a plan. They fortunately had this treatment room free, and they said, okay, you can stay there for a couple of hours, and if the labor progresses, then we admit you into a birthing suite, and if it doesn't, then we can revisit. And by the time I went into this treatment room, I was still joking, talking pretty much normally, but then within an hour, even less, everything changed. My contractions got really strong, and it was obvious for everyone that the birth is imminent. So as a result, I got admitted to the birthing suite, and this is your important lesson. Listen to your body, advocate for yourself. Yes, health professionals are talking from experience. They try to, but they don't always gauge correctly where you're at. And your body does know. So do not ignore those signs. And at this point, it's just about managing my contractions. Something funny along those lines that you may see in the movies is that a woman is always forced into like lying on her back position, and this is where she stays, and there's this like coached pushing where everyone tells her to push or stop, and this goes on forever. In actuality, at this point, in modern birthing environments, you're actually encouraged to move around. They will give you heat packs, they will give you yoga balls, etc. Encourage you to get comfortable in any way that comfortable feels to you. Another common misconception is that basically there is 2 tiers of birth. Natural wild birth when you don't get any help and any assistance, and a full suite of medical interventions when you get hooked to machines, get an epidural, get all sorts of pain relief, and the baby gets taken out of you. In actuality, while yes, consenting to interventions does increase the chances of more interventions, ultimately, the spectrum is few and far between. For both of my births, I did not have any interventions or pain relief, apart from laughing gas. It didn't actually work that well for my first birth. For my second birth, it was absolutely incredible. It just sort of zonks you out in a sense that you are aware and you're present but you don't care. It's a very interesting feeling. There are no serious risks, to my knowledge, for mother or baby from this, and the risks associated with the laughing gas use are actually more towards the medical personnel, like the midwives, who are exposed to it every day. I have found some really interesting articles and stories in how it may, if the rooms are not aired correctly, or if midwives are getting too much exposure to it, cause health complications such as anemia. And this is really icky, obviously. However, just know that for you, mother, and for your baby, there's probably some risk. But I'm actually not aware of anything that would turn me personally off using it. So at this point, I'm breathing on the gas, I'm changing positions, and then at a certain point, labor intensifies. Basically goes like, switch, pew, and it's been only a couple of hours. So it's very fast, much faster than my first labor. And at this point, I'm sort of like side lying on a bed, really uncomfortable, feeling the urge to push. And at the same time, it gets to the point where I start saying, oh, I can't do this anymore, this is too much. And this is usually when the midwives in the room might get silently excited, because usually this state means that you're getting really, really close to actually giving birth. My first birth was a water birth, and our hospital suites do allow for it, provided there are no complications or interventions that might interfere with this process. So at this point, I ask them to fill the bath. It's happening. Everyone already knows it's happening. I also pooped myself at that time. This is very normal, by the way. So I asked them to fill the bath, and this is where my waters break, actually rather dramatically, like, and then the bath is not even like half full yet, and me and one of the midwives look at each other, and she's like, you're not gonna make it to the pool. And I hear that water trickling, and I really want to be in it, but I'm like, I know. And then I asked them to stop the water because the sound of it kept reminding me of what could have been, and within the next 10 minutes, my baby girl was born. And again, mind you, there is no crazy pushing, some crazy screaming. It's not like often in the movies when you're surrounded by a crowd of people in white coats and they're all screaming at you. Apart from the primal noises women tend to make, it's actually quite peaceful in its own twisted way. And then she was laid on my chest, skin to skin. By the way, something else that movies don't mention is that you're also supposed to give birth to a placenta, and the baby is born still attached to it. We're waiting for the placenta at this point, and I wanted to give birth to it naturally. However, it wasn't coming, and I started bleeding a fair bit. So I did consent to an injection, and placenta comes out. However, I'm still bleeding. And it's at this point evident that the blood volume is quite a lot. Suddenly, the room fills with like an IV and midwives and doctors, and they like look at me, and I look at them, and they're like, oh, don't stress. And I'm like, oh, I mean, I'm not stressed, but the fact that there were like 2 of you and now there's 5 million of you is a little bit concerning. I will give a massive nod to Australian birth protocols at this stage, though, because my baby is still with me. We're still breastfeeding, we're still doing skin to skin, and all this is kind of like happening around us, and everyone is very respectfully working around us. I had a few rounds of people examining me. Then a surgeon came to do the stitches, because I did get a 2nd-degree tear with both of my births, actually. Ouch, ouch. So they thought that once the surgeon stitches me up, this is where the bleeding will stop. The bleeding still does not stop. I get like these like ooey gooey yucky warm gushes every now and then, and I'm like, this is not normal. And they're like, no, this is not normal. And it was about a liter by the estimates that I've lost by this point, so this is not looking like super cheerful. So then they called an OBGYN with a giant speculum. She comes in. The day before, I actually did briefly see this OBGYN. So she's like, oh, it's you. So it was a sweet, sweet reunion. So she actually determined there was a tiny, tiny piece of retained placenta, which was likely causing the bleeding. And indeed, after that was resolved, everything started going back to normal. But one of the medications that I got gave me a spike in fever and like wild shivers. I'm like, so I can't even hold the baby. So I give her to my husband at this point. And the midwife says, if you have a fever, they're going to suspect infection and give you antibiotics. And it's likely that it might be this medication, actually. So would you be happy to just like wait and see? And I said that, of course, I would be. They gave me some Panadol to see if that helps. It did within a couple of hours. So luckily didn't get antibiotics. But after all this ordeal, my goal of going home within 5 hours after birth, which I did with my first baby, which they're happy to do if there are no complications and some basic like tests are done, was pretty much not a very good idea. And obviously they don't hold you, but they say like, oh, we think because of this, this, and this, it would be best if you stayed overnight. Are you happy to do so? So I stayed overnight. On the positive note, we did get to do all the tests that with my first baby, I either had the midwives come in later or had to actually go somewhere to do them, like the hearing test. But staying overnight at the hospital with a tiny baby with all those like beeps, lights, and nurses was not my favorite experience, and I was really missing my toddler. However, by the end of next day I was discharged. Despite not getting much rest and being really like sleepy, I was otherwise feeling much more recovered and rested compared to when I went home 6 hours later with my first. Another thing you might expect from the movies is you bring the baby home and everything is suddenly magical. Postpartum recovery is rough, my friends. No matter how you gave birth, you're going to be exhausted. Please get as much help as you can. I highly recommend making sure that your freezer is like bursting with foods that you can just throw in the microwave. If I had one take-home message for you, it would be this. Know your birth. Really familiarize yourself with how it works. Know your anatomy. Know what happens before, during, and after. Do thorough examination and discussion with your birthing team about risks and benefits of any interventions you might be considering and different routes birth might take. Know your breastfeeding. We're often so obsessed with building perfect baby registries. However, all this vital stuff that will actually play a pivotal role in your recovery doesn't even cross our minds. If you're already a parent, I would love to hear your experiences in the comments. And if you're yet to become a parent, I wish you the most exciting and most magical journey. And as you can see, I must leave now. See you next time.